don't think too hard about all of this. Just go out and kill a few beasts. It's for your own good. You know, it's just what hunters do.
Hey there, my name is Alex. I am the Silver Mont, and in this video we're going to be talking Bloodborne, a game all about hunters. And specifically we'll be discussing the first hunter, the man who all hunters model themselves after, consciously or no, Gehrman, a soft-spoken, kindly old man by all accounts. But there is a good deal of mystery surrounding him. Hopefully by the end of this video we'll uncover a little of it, and if nothing else, it'll get you thinking. That said, let's get started, and it would make sense to start with his name. When introducing himself to us, Gehrman struggles for a second to recall his name. The most likely explanation for this would be that he simply momentarily forgot. Another, less likely explanation would be that it is not his real name, but rather one that he has assumed, almost like a title. I don't really think that is the case though, but sometimes it's good to look at things from other angles. His actual title, of course, is The First Hunter. As for Gehrman the name, I believe it's German in origin, funnily enough, but I'm not entirely sure on that. Gehr seems to come from an old German variation of a word that means spear, but I don't think there's anything too relevant we can take from that. At least not for now, but I'll touch on that a bit later. So what do we know about Gehrman? Not a lot, but I expect you're used to hearing that if you've played these games before. We know that he has the impressive title of First Hunter, and we know that he knows of Lawrence, Willem and Ludwig. And I believe it's fair to say that he was on fairly close terms with at least Lawrence. Gehrman could tell us so much, but doesn't. That would imply that he doesn't deem it necessary. He knows the eldritch truth behind the goings-on in Gehrman. So why doesn't he tell us? What can be gained from keeping us in the dark until the very end? What has happened to cause Gehrman to treat hunters the way he does? And is there a connection between him and the doll? And what about that scythe of his? Trick weapon wielded by Gehrman, the first hunter. A masterpiece that defined the entire array of weapons crafted at the workshop. Its blade is forged with siderite, said to have fallen from the heavens. Gehrman surely saw the hunt as a dirge of farewell, wishing only that his prey might rest in peace, never again to awaken to another harrowing nightmare. And that also tells us that Gehrman knew the truth of the beasts, that all beasts were once men. Along with his garb, it tells us that the hunter's unique brand of combat can all be traced back to Gehrman, engaging beasts with speed. And likewise, we know that beasts can render armour somewhat useless, their claws able to rend through metal just as they do flesh. So Gehrman opted for speed and stealth over brute force, because when it comes to brute force, a beast will always win. Now, just as a forewarning, I'm about to go speculation heavy. None of this is canon or confirmed in any way. It is my own belief, my own theory you could say. I have some ideas concerning Gehrman. Let's go back to Byrgenwerth for a moment. Lawrence and Willem's House of Learning. We know that. It's an idyllic lakeside manor. And we know that Gehrman knew of Lawrence, and he refers to Willem as master. So was he a student of Byrgenwerth? In my opinion, Gehrman was a groundskeeper, perhaps even a farmer who tended Byrgenwerth. The reason behind this is Gehrman's choice of weapon, the scythe. Now, a scythe isn't primarily a weapon, it's an agricultural tool. You could say it's like a manual lawnmower used to cut through grass and reap crops. Of course, it also has a strong association with death, the Grim Reaper, for he reaps and harvests life itself instead of crops. Now, just because Gehrman uses a scythe doesn't mean he's a farmer, but do you remember Dawes? Robe of Dawes, grave guard of the Forbidden Woods. His pale countenance mimics the Labyrinth Watchers. Willem kept 2 loyal servants back at Byrgenwerth. When they were sent into the labyrinth, they encountered the eldritch truth and went mad. One became the password gatekeeper, while Dawes became a graveguard of the forest. Both remained loyal, even in madness. Emphasis on Willem kept 2 loyal servants, which means that he obviously employed people to some extent. I'm not saying one of those two loyal servants was Gehrman, as we know who both of them are. I'm saying perhaps Gehrman also worked at Byrgenwerth, but not as a servant. I feel perhaps Gehrman was of a similar ilk to those two. Remember how the forest surrounding Byrgenwerth had grown so close to the manor? So in this headcanon, we have groundskeeper Gehrman, and then the Beast Scourge breaks out. Doesn't that seem fitting? Perhaps the Knights of Cainhurst Castle fought the beasts and were powerless even with their armour, but then Gehrman, a simple farmer, was able to defeat them. I don't know, I just kinda like that image. I don't think Gehrman is an especially smart or intellectual person, nor one to even consider the deep concepts and philosophies of Willem and Lawrence. I think he was just a loyal friend, skilled enough to hunt the beasts. That's just what I think. Again, none of that is confirmed, just a little theory I entertain myself with. Oh, and concerning his name, if Gehr means spear, then I guess we could say Gehrman means spearman. And spearmen are quite often simple, common soldiers, and I feel like you can draw a parallel between that and Gehrman being a farmer, using such simple, effective tactics. But no doubt I'm reading far too much into things, so let's get back into the realm of the factual. Or at least, as factual as we get with Bloodborne.
Oh, Lawrence, Master Willem, somebody help me, unshackle me, please, anybody. I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
Lawrence seems to have assigned Gehrman some task, or at least Gehrman appears to be waiting for Lawrence. Without realising that he is most likely dead, the skull in the Grand Cathedral that Amelia was praying by, that is almost assuredly Lawrence's. Some believe that he is actually one of the beasts we encounter in the Chalice dungeons, however. Of course, none of that is confirmed, but Miyazaki himself has strongly hinted that the skull belongs to Lawrence, and I think that is a fair assumption to make. Either way, I don't think Lawrence is around at the moment. So that would mean that Gehrman doesn't know that Lawrence is dead, or at least not around. So how much does he know of the outside world, the world outside of the hunter's dream? Do the messengers whisper to him of goings-ons? What about the moon presence? Does it tell him when it's found a new hunter? Indeed, is the moon presence even the one who finds the hunter? Or does the moon presence only appear after Gehrman is killed? Either way, it appears that Gehrman is the host of the hunter's dream, the dream itself a mirror of the hunter's workshop in Yharnam, perhaps a manifestation of Gehrman's inner world, so to speak. We've spoken before on his relationship, or lack thereof, with the doll, and if you'd like to know more about that, there's a video linked in the description down below, and you can check out that video, if you'd like to postulate more on that anyway. But what about Gehrman's relationship with the moon presence? Does he know it exists? He never mentions it, but then Gehrman doesn't really tell us much at all. During our battle with him, at some point he does seem to channel power from the moon, so I think he probably does know about the moon presence, but then what does Lawrence, or rather what did Lawrence expect of Gehrman and the moon presence? Lawrence appears to be the one who beckoned the moon presence, but why was Gehrman chosen to be the host? Was it so that he could train other hunters, future generations? Was it a way of preserving his skills and knowledge? None of that seems likely, considering that he doesn't train us in any way. It would make sense that he does train us to explain why our character becomes more and more proficient, but no, he doesn't really help us in any ways, which is kind of strange. The only time Gehrman's unique skills come into play, the only situation in the hunter's dream that would require him, is when we refuse his offer of mercy, at which point he remarks that the hunter's helper will deal with us, that he will join the hunt. But outside of attempting to kill the hunter, Gehrman's role in the dream could surely be played by anyone, or perhaps it requires some immense mental and physical fortitude that only Gehrman possesses. And on that note, it's another sign of Gehrman's loyalty. He doesn't want to be in the dream, he wants to wake up, to die perhaps, and yet he does his mysterious duty. If we refuse his offer, he will fight us to the death. If defeated, he'll be freed of his duty, only for us to potentially take his place. Speaking of which, does he even know how much time has passed? Perhaps to him it's only been a few days since he began hosting the dream, when in reality it could be 100 years or more. But considering that Willem is still alive, but then you also have to consider that Willem probably isn't entirely human at this point. Who can say? The timeline of Bloodborne is very obscure. Ultimately, Gehrman was the first hunter. Perhaps he saw it his duty to also be the last, to ensure that eventually there would be no more hunts and no need for hunters, or their terrible dream. But who can say for sure? Either way, his intentions could be pure, or perhaps they were at some point, only for the first hunter to have since lost his way. What are you prepared to believe?
A corpse should be left well alone. Oh, I know very well how the secret beckons so sweetly. Only an honest death will kill you now. Liberate you from your wild curiosity.
Now, I was going to end it here, but maybe you heard of a little something that came out recently? The Old Hunters. I wrote everything up to this point before that came out, but seeing as how it was so close to release, I thought I would wait and see, and it's a good thing I did, because we've had some very important information released in regards to Gehrman and the doll. We now know almost certainly just who the doll is based on. Delving into the Old Hunter's nightmare, the good hunter will eventually hear tell of Lady Maria, an old hunter, one of the first students of Gehrman. She guards the secret of the nightmare, but we'll talk more about that another time. For now, let's focus on Maria herself, and her relationship with Gehrman. Among the first hunters, all students of Gehrman, was the lady hunter Maria. This was her hunter's garb crafted in Canehurst. Maria is distantly related to the undead queen, but had great admiration for Gehrman, unaware of his curious mania. Just a few lines, and yet it tells us so very much, the best kind of item description. Let's bullet point this new information, shall we? Maria was a student of Gehrman. She's probably related to Queen Annalise and presumably grew up in Canehurst. She admired Gehrman, but was unaware of his curious mania, and the hunter's cap is based on her design. So what does all that mean in real terms? Well, let's start with Gehrman's curious mania. To me, that implies that Gehrman had romantic feelings for Maria. Of course, there are other things it could well mean, but when we consider the doll, who strongly resembles Maria, it seems to me that Gehrman created it in her image, or had it made by another in her image. This could also explain Gehrman's dismissive nature in regards to the doll. Maybe that was all a very long time ago, and by now he has realised that no matter how lifelike, the doll is not Maria, but merely a physical representation of his wishes, and likely not a very healthy one. And you know, I think this works well with what I was saying earlier. If the Knights of Canehurst were unable to stand against the beasts, and yet a younger Gehrman was, it only makes sense that those same knights would be trained by Gehrman, no? And amongst their number we have Lady Maria, perhaps a cousin to Annalise. The beautiful noble, with her ivory skin and pale hair, by all accounts, soft-spoken and kind, if we are to believe the Blood Saint Adeline. It is easy to see why Gehrman could have developed feelings for her, but if he was but a simple, low-born farmer, What chance could he possibly have with such an important lady? By all means, none of this is confirmed. It's only what I choose to believe. It fits with how I imagine these characters. Even had the items not outright told us that Maria is a relation of the undead queen, Annalise not being strictly named, but it most likely refers to her. The fact that Maria uses blood-based attacks during our battle with her is very telling. It also further reinforces the notion that the nobles of Cainhurst are descendants of the Thumerians. Queen Yharnam uses very similar blood blade attacks, and of course, we can't ignore the fact that Maria is tall and shares similar coloration to the Thumerians. Pale skin, pale hair, and an almost ethereal elfin beauty. Yet, Maria disliked blood blades, preferring her own rakuyo weapon, which instead demands great dexterity and skill of the user. Could this be the influence of Gehrman? As we all know, his combat style does not favour magic or blood, only great skill and dexterity for the most part. Maria is not only extremely proficient with her blades, yet seems to have mastered the art of quickening, evading with such speed and precision that they seem to vanish entirely. But when we fight her in the nightmare, there are 3 important things to note. First up, she appears to be a corpse, and she remarks that a corpse should be undisturbed. She appears lifeless at first. Second, although she dislikes blood blades, she will use them against us. This could of course be likened to a player not liking to use a distasteful weapon or tactic, perhaps healing during an invasion, but when pushed, they may use it anyway as a last resort. After all, she doesn't initiate the battle using her blood blades. She only does it when she has been brought fairly close to death. Last of all, we have the fact that she is using the rakuyo, even though the description of the weapon states that she, one day, dropped the weapon into a well when she could stomach it no longer. Of course, considering we fight her in a nightmare, who is to say we are really fighting her? Or that the timeline has not been shifted and obscured? Speaking of which, just how does the timeline of Bloodborne work now? Logarius and his band of executioners wore garb that would later be the basis for healing church gear, the holy shawl specifically, and we know that Ludwig wore something extremely similar. But judging from Maria, we can assume that Cainhurst were at least on somewhat good terms with Byrgenwerth for a time. So was it after Maria had vanished that the rogue scholar of Byrgenwerth betrayed them, and Logarius led his executioners to Cainhurst? Just who is Logarius? After all, he seems far older than most characters we come across. He does not use a transforming weapon, or a firearm. He does not seem to be a hunter, not even an old hunter. He seems to have his own method of fighting, which always indicated to me that he was around before the hunters. But this new information would seem to imply that he came after the time of Gehrman, if only a little. But returning to the topic of Gehrman and Maria, we know that Byrgenwerth committed some atrocity in the unnamed fishing hamlet. Is that what caused Lady Maria to abandon her weapon, whatever she witnessed there? After all, if she became a hunter to protect people from beasts, whatever Byrgenwerth did in the fishing hamlet could well have betrayed her ideals. At any rate, it appears she looked after the unfortunate victims of the research hall. These same victims perhaps being kidnapped from the hamlet, which could mean this was her atonement. Maria did what she could to comfort them in their pitiful state. But how much did Gehrman know of that? Perhaps not too much, but we know he shares some connection to the Orphan of Kos. As fellow dreamers, perhaps he can share in the orphan's misery. Gehrman, who still sits and waits for Lawrence. Gehrman, who sleeps peacefully only when the poor, wizened child of Kos has been silenced, or when we release him from this terrible hunter's dream.
Ah, sweet child of Kos, returned to the ocean. A bottomless curse, a bottomless sea, accepting of all that there is and can be.
can hear Gehrman sleeping. On any other night, he'd be restless. But on this night, he sounds so very calm. Perhaps something has eased his suffering.